Well, President Trump's controversial comments on immigrants from expletive-hole countries reportedly includes the country of El Salvador. The comments come just days after the Trump administration announced it will rescind protected status of nearly 200,000 Salvadoran immigrants. The White House decision gives those with temporary protected status until September 9th of 2019 to leave or face deportation. Immigrants from Haiti, Nicaragua, and Sudan also have protections set to expire. The New Yorker recently investigated how deportation can lead to many former immigrants facing danger in their home countries. The report shares the stories of several immigrants. Sarah Stillman is the author of that piece, and she's a staff writer at The New Yorker, and she joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you for having me here.
You open this piece with an incredible story of a woman who finds herself under these circumstances, and that last scene that you paint as she's being deported, and she looks over her shoulder and says, when you find my dead body, it'll be on your conscience. Can you tell us a little bit more about her story?
Absolutely. So I wrote about a woman named Laura. She'd been living most of her adult life in the U.S. and Texas undocumented. She had U.S. citizen children. She had a job that she was driving home from one night, and she was pulled over for a minor traffic violation, so driving between two lanes. And for whatever reason, the cop did something that was unconventional at the time, but is now becoming more and more common under Trump, which is that he asked about her immigration status, turned her over to Border Patrol, and she was pleading for her life because this was someone who had been in a violent relationship. The man was back in Mexico. He was threatening to kill her if she was sent back. And so she did turn to Border Patrol, and she said, you know, if I am sent back, my death will be on your conscience. And in fact, that very night she was sent back, and the very next week she was found dead, killed by the man who she had thought would kill her.
And it's funny because, you know, often we talk about how people who are here illegally don't go to law enforcement when they are the victims of a crime. And I thought, as I was reading, that's the way the story was going to go, that she was so nervous about revealing her status that she didn't turn him over. And she actually did. She did everything right. And the result was so tragic.
Yeah, and part of the investigation was also reaching out to police departments and we filed more than 20 Freedom of Information Act requests with police departments asking how they've seen a change, or if they've seen a change in domestic violence and sexual assault reporting. And we saw some dramatic findings there as well. We're finding that many people in areas where there's a lot of undocumented people now are afraid to report crime based on immigration anxieties.
You write about the issue of non-refoulement. What is that? Explain it to our audience.
Right, so it translates to non-return, and it's a principle in both international law and domestic law, whereby the U.S. has said, you know, we will never send people back to situations in which we know they could be killed or tortured. And this really grew out of World War II. So many of us are familiar with the stories of Jewish people who came fleeing Nazi Germany. There was a boat of 900 people that was turned away, and then many thousands more were denied refugee status here during World War II. And many of those people were sent back to their deaths. And I believe in an act of repentance, the U.S. and the international community realized we needed to do things differently. And we set about establishing laws that would guarantee that we were not sending people back knowingly.
You know, it's interesting, the debate over immigrants in this country, especially those with temporary protected status like people from El Salvador and Haitians, is that it's temporary. That's what you hear from the president's supporters, the members of his party. The T means temporary. And yet, in the same breath, they'll say, well, Emery, would you ever want to move to Haiti? Would you ever want to move to El Salvador? In other words, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too by saying these are terrible places, S-holes, as the president is alleged to have called them. And yet, you need to go back because it's a temporary status. The temporary status was put into place, if you go by their logic, because those places are places that are difficult and have been difficult either through natural disasters or because of real fear from the government.
Right, and because of things that involve U.S. government interactions in the 1980s. I mean, a lot of this has its roots in the wars, the Central America Wars of the 1980s, which the U.S. largely supported. And then many people who came here, formed gangs in U.S. prisons, got deported, and then now have been central to the formation of gangs in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So we certainly need to look at the deeper roots of the problem. But perhaps more pertinent is recognizing that.
I think that's a great point. But still, you know, there are many people, both Democrats and Republicans, that will say, look, there needs to be reform. Some some of these protections are being used as loopholes for people to stay in this country. Take us through the process. I mean, how do you verify that someone's life really is threatened if they return to their home country?
Right. It's not an easy process, but we do have people who are trained, and the extensive vetting process is done by officers of USCIS, so they're known as asylum officers. And initially, if someone comes to the country, appears at the border, and they are presented to Border Patrol is obliged to ask them a set of questions, and that includes, do you fear for your life if you're sent back? It's not Border Patrol's job to analyze those fears. It is mandatory that they pass the person along to the asylum officer, and that's when the next stage of corroboration comes in. So people often are able to show documents. I interviewed a number of women who had documentation that their loved ones in El Salvador or in Honduras had actually been violently murdered. I spoke to one woman who had 3 siblings who were violently killed by gangs, and she was still sent back after she expressed her fear. So oftentimes those direct expressions of fear and the proof of it is being ignored, and people are still being sent back.
It's such a powerful story. It's entitled "When Deportation is a Death Sentence," and that's literally what it was for Laura. Sarah Stillman, it's an incredible piece, and you can also listen to it if there are those of you who don't want to read, because it's actually a very heavy piece, but it's worth the time to read it and to understand this problem in detail, because too often this problem is discussed in terms of sound bites, in terms of what sounds good, on television. But when you actually read and you understand what it is that some of these individuals are going through and the things that they struggle with on a daily basis and what they bring to this country, a woman who had a great job, who had kids that were born in this country, American citizens, when you think about how her life ended, thank you very much, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.